In March of 1932, she met a barrister, Leigh Holman. By December of the same year, they were married.
She thought that by leaving home and by becoming a housewife, becoming his wife, and that would be a satisfying escape from home into a bright new world, but it wasn't quite enough.
Vivien had blossomed into a rare beauty and was turning the heads of all of those who met her. She took up acting and pursued her career with determination. In 1933, she gave birth to a daughter, Suzanne.
Even Vivien would admit that she was by no means a good mother at all. She almost gave birth to a child without any of the normal maternal instincts being sort of engaged.
In 1936, she embarked on a passionate love affair with the dashing actor Laurence Olivier. Cast opposite each other in Fire Over England, they played out their affair both on and off the set. Olivier was married to the actress Jill Esmond, who was about to give birth to his son Tarquin.
Vivien always covered herself with dense cascades of perfume. And when my birth started, my mother rang the studio and said it started. And they had been in a clinch scene on set, as well as elsewhere, I'm sure. And, of course, Vivien, all her scent was on him, and my mother was giving birth to me. It must have been about the most cruel way of giving birth to the child of the man you're married to.
They were Scott Fitzgerald's beautiful people. Attractiveness is a human quality that helps tremendously in the theatre and in television and in films. And I mean, if you've got a talent that matches it, I mean, it's absolutely galvanic.
She looked absolutely ravishing, and she had a kind of controlled sexiness, which was far sexier than anything that the Americans at that time were doing.
Because although she was a ravishingly beautiful woman, she always felt that her beauty was a handicap, that people only saw the beauty and they neglected the talent when they looked at her.
In 1937, Vivien left Leigh Holman for Olivier. Deeply in love, they moved into a charming cottage in Chelsea and set about making a home together. In 1938, Olivier set sail for America to film Wuthering Heights. Vivien swiftly followed him, determined to get an audition for Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind.
The prudishness of Hollywood at that time demanded that they be perceived as having separate residences. Of course they didn't. And the secrecy added to the sort of magic. And one tired old agent went to see them one weekend, and he said, God, even the front door makes me feel sexy. Even makes me want to have my wife.
Against all the odds, Vivien landed the plum role of the century, Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind.
I think he was thrilled she got the part. It was the most sought-after part ever. And she knew she was going to get it. She absolutely knew. Nobody else thought so. She said, you'll see, I'll get it.
Vivien was headstrong. She acted on impulse. She had no sense of consequence, which is what exactly is done by Scarlett O'Hara in the book and in the film. She goes out of her way at whatever cost to herself and others to get what she wants. And if she has to cry over it, well, she'll cry tomorrow, for tomorrow is another day.
Vivien Leigh was the first British actress to win an Oscar.
He was seething with jealousy. He was hoping to get the Oscar for playing Heathcliff. And on the way home, he told me he was so desperately jealous, he really wanted to hit her on the head with the Oscar.
In 1940, Larry and Vivien got married in a civil ceremony in California. Meanwhile, war had broken out in Europe, and they were keen to get back to England. They played opposite each other in the patriotic film Lady Hamilton.
In 1944, she went with a number of other actors, including John Gielgud, to entertain troops. And for about 3 months, there they were, in that heat, drinking that water and that awful food. And she was not robust, and she lost a lot of weight, and immediately went back into filming. And she conceived a child with Larry, and went straight into moving.
During the filming of this scene, Vivien tripped and fell. The shock to her frail system caused her to miscarry.
Cleopatra, the Queen.
Vivien soldiered on with filming under a cloud of depression. Her changed mood produced some of her best acting in the final scenes of the film, where Cleopatra had become hardened and more dignified. At around this time, the Oliviers bought Notley Abbey, a medieval mansion in Buckinghamshire.
When they were acting, which was more often than not in plays, they would drive down after the show on Saturday, and the guests would all arrive around about midnight, and they'd sit down to a very nice dinner, and probably spend most of the time out having a whale of a time. It was a very star place to be. It was very stylish.
They gave very good parties at Notley Abbey and in London, and the problem was that Larry would need sleep at night, and she would keep the party going till 5 o'clock in the morning, or longer to breakfast time, because she could go by without sleep.
He told me that when she was on her upward surge, it was like a racing driver going full speed and changing the engine down to third gear, so making the engine go far, and then just a second gear. There's this extraordinary energy, and he said her defiance against the world was very moving, and it was sort of, he admired her gutsiness, and he said it was actually very sexy.
Vivien had suffered from tuberculosis since she was a child. With the pressures of filming and all-night partying, the illness came back with a vengeance. In May 1945, she was forced to spend 9 months convalescing.
One night after a great sort of party, next day she was so ill that doctors were summoned, and I happened to be the only other woman on that particular occasion. And we had Danny Kaye, and we had Orson Welles and various people. And to lunch, you know, she couldn't come downstairs because she was ill.
After her recovery, she took on the role of Anna Karenina. She felt she could bring some truth to the role of a woman who had left her home, husband and child for love. During the filming of Anna Karenina, Vivien had shown worrying signs of mental instability. The miscarriage and tuberculosis, combined with Vivien's manic energy, conspired to send her off balance. It became clear that she was suffering from manic depression.
At one time, in desperation, she said, why can't I have a respectable illness like cancer, which to some extent people understood. People simply didn't understand manic depression. I mean, they don't totally understand it now, but they understand it a lot better than they did in those days. I mean, they just thought she was behaving badly.
Despite her illness, Vivien played Blanche Dubois in A Streetcar Named Desire. Fact and fiction became dangerously blurred in this story of a woman on the verge of madness.
Every single role that Vivien played passed into her character to some extent. And there's no doubt that when Vivien was Blanche Dubois, that was very alarming indeed. Because Vivien, of course, suffered from a form of mental instability. And so when one of these great torturous roles took over, then she was really hard to live with.
She really was Blanche Dubois most of her life, and Blanche Dubois is barking, basically. I mean, she's you know, on the way to the madhouse. And I mean, Vivien did in a funny way depend on the kindness of strangers, which is the great line in that play, because in a funny way that the friends finally had to give up on her, and she would sort of take strangers into her house and sometimes into her bed.
In 1953, Vivien joined the charismatic actor Peter Finch in Sri Lanka to film Elephant Walk. Irresistibly drawn towards each other, the two embarked on a torrid affair. Sri Lanka and Peter Finch were an explosive combination.
I don't think anything happened between Peter Finch and Vivien until 1953 when they did Elephant Walk. There was an instant galvanic attraction, physical attraction between Vivien Leigh and Peter Finch, and then of course she had this terrible breakdown.
Vivien was in a dangerous state. She was staying out all night and for the first time forgetting her lines. In desperation, Olivier was sent for. His son, Tarquin, saw him off at the airport.
Something I wanted to tell you. Vivien has had a terrible attack, and I've got to go out to Sri Lanka and bring her back, and the film is going to stop, and they're going to have to recast it, and it's going to cost the producer a lot of money, and I'll be at the middle of all that, and I'm not looking forward to it one bit. Now, the disease, manic depression, means whom you most love, the disease makes you show hatred for. And he said, from her behavior, it's obvious she must love me to death.
In a highly vulnerable state, Vivien arrived to a bank of newspaper reporters and photographers. She was sent to hospital and given ECT, in which electric currents are sent through the body. She was to suffer the treatment many more times.
There were times when she would literally go on stage and under the stage makeup there would be burn marks on the side of her head, and it's completely grotesque. Now, of course, these things can be controlled by lithium, and by and large, manic depressives don't go through anything like what she went through.
I went to see her when she'd recovered, and she just said, "Oh, Colin, it's so nice when it's over." That was the only time she really ever referred to it, because, of course, when it was building up, although she knew it, she couldn't control it.
Back in England, Vivien continued her affair with Peter Finch.
He came down to Notley, the terrible Finch, yes. I never liked him. I was outraged, having an affair with Vivien. It was absolutely horrendous. He was very amusing. He told a good story, good raconteur, fulfilled Vivien's needs. She was a very demanding lady. And when Larry was acting and burning up energy, he didn't always have a great deal of energy left. And she needed it.
In 1957, the Oliviers toured Eastern Europe with Titus Andronicus. Colin Clark was the stage manager and Vivien's chaperone.
She came along on the Titus Andronicus tour rather for the ride, and she thoroughly enjoyed herself. She was the most sought-after guest in all the cities we went to, Paris and Vienna and Venice. She had a full social life, and by bad luck, one of her cycles of mental ill health was coming round. So she started to go pretty crazy, really. When we went to Yugoslavia, Vivien's mental problems were coming to a crisis point, and she really could hardly get onto stage. She was so disturbed and so sort of confused. And she loved Yugoslavia, she decided, and she didn't want to leave it. So when time came to leave, she wouldn't get on the train. And I suppose we spent about 20 minutes while the train was held up. And in the end, the police chief, he just picked her up and plonked her on the train. And she went, pow, and she socked him right in the eye. Gave him a great big shiner.
Although they presented a united front to their public, the Olivier marriage was a sham.
I remember going up this weekend, we were having afternoon tea, and Olivier came in and he was leaving. You know, he was coming, he'd come to collect something. And it was like being in a mortuary with the fridge door open. You know, you really felt you were in the presence of corpses, his and hers, the corpse of what had been for 10 years idyllic.
In 1960, Vivien was back in America performing in Jewel of Angels. She rang her favourite journalist, David Lewin, in a state.
I said, "Vivien, it must be pretty important." She said, "Yeah, it is. I've just had this letter from Larry," and she produced, and I'll never forget it. It was in Larry's handwriting, and it said, "Dear Vivien, I am bored with the legend of the O's." I said, "What are you going to do?" She said, "I'm going to leave it. I don't know what Larry boy thinks he's doing, but if he feels like this in a month's time, then I'll give him the divorce he wants."
Larry had started an affair with Joan Plowright, who he married in 1961. Vivien became involved with an actor, Jack Merivale. They had known each other for years, and Jack was a willing protector.
He was a wonderful companion, very handsome, nice fellow. He didn't have very much energy. She once said to me, he's one of those long, pale green things that always spends half the day asleep. It's a bit cruel.
Vivien and Jack set up home together in Eaton Square in Belgravia. She went on to produce great performances in films like The Roman Spring of Mrs. Stone, the story of a middle-aged woman who falls for a young gigolo, played by Warren Beatty.
Vivien was using film almost as therapy by that time. Mrs. Stone is passing through the middle age of the emotions. Vivien Leigh herself was passing through the middle age of the emotions, and for the first time in her life was without her great partner, Laurence Olivier. So again, something of Vivien's strange mental state entered into her performance as Karen Stone.
In the spring of 1967, tuberculosis, Vivien's old ghost, returned to haunt her. Her secretary, Rosemary Geddes, was concerned that she wasn't looking after herself.
She started to cough a lot, you know, but of course she was always afraid of it coming back and didn't want to go to the doctors for ages. And then in the end, she was persuaded to go, and her lungs were x-rayed and she was found to have another flare-up of the tuberculosis. And the doctor advised that she went into hospital, but she wouldn't go. She didn't want to go. She got up and walked around. She was supposed to be in bed most of the time, but she did get up and walk around a lot. And I could see she wasn't getting any better.
On July the 7th, 1967, at the age of 53, she was found dead in her bedroom. Olivier was among the first to be called. Years later, his son found him watching Vivien on film.
He saw on television late one night Vivien in Roman Spring of Mrs. Stone, and I was staying with him at the time. And he was in such a state of tears. He couldn't sleep at all, and a day later he was still in tears. And, oh God, what could have gone wrong? She was so talented as an actress and so beautiful, and that voice, I'd forgotten how lovely her voice was. She was the love of his life, there's no question.
I wasn't altogether surprised when I heard that Vivien had died. I'd seen her quite recently. I'd been over to where she and Jack Marivaux were living. He'd looked after Vivien for many years and been very good at looking after her. But I rather sensed he'd got bored with that. Vivien had realized that. I got the impression that she felt, that's it. Le rideau est tombé. The curtain has fallen now. Time to go. Time to get off the stage.